And we are live and rocking and rolling. Welcome to another edition of the Entity Framework Core Teams Community Stand-Up. Today we are taking a voyage into planetary scale databases. That's what the materials say anyway, with Azure Cosmos DB. But first, let's introduce who's on the show today. My name is Jeremy Likness. I'm a PM for .NET Data at Microsoft. And with us, we have our guest, David Pine. David, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yep, David Pine. I'm apparently the 7th iteration of David Pines on Twitter. So you can find me at David Pine 7. I'm a senior content developer for the .NET Docs team, and I write about C#, .NET, .NET Core, .NET 5, all the things. I'm really excited to be here today.
So you have your own show too, don't you?
Yeah. So I'm actually one of the co-hosts for the .NET Docs show. And hopefully we can look at a little bit of that source code later and kind of show off the site. We're actually using the repository package that I built out on the site. So it's in production today. Woohoo!
Nice. So with us, we also have Bryce.
Howdy, I'm Bryce Lamson. I'm a dev on the EF team. Usually work on the SQLite provider, but I watched very closely as I built the Cosmos provider.
Nice. And Shai.
Yeah, I'm Shai Rojansky, the first and only iteration on Twitter and probably everywhere else with my name. I am an engineer on the team. I do a lot of work on Postgres. I'm very interested in performance and hoping we're going to do a lot of that in 6.0 and generally open source and the lower level data APIs, so ADO.NET system data stuff as well. That's about it.
Nice. Well, let's jump into some community links, and then I know David has a lot of code and exciting bits to share with us. So let me pull up some links here. And the first link is a little bit of Inception. It's a show note that links to a show note. But we had Julie Lerman was on the .NET Docs show recently, and this was a great episode, and I'm not saying that just because she says nice things about our team. There was a lot of good content and information, so highly encourage you to carve out, I forgot how long it was, but it was usually like 45 minutes?
It's an hour. Yeah, our show's an hour.
Just like ours. So about, oh, go ahead.
It was very fun to watch, just a bunch of friends sitting around and chatting.
That's right, and that's how these shows should be, right? Nice and casual. So this is a big announcement. Entity Framework Core Release Candidate 2. Not a huge list of new features because we're obviously winding down to get to our final release. So we addressed some defects, but we are looking for everyone to pull this down, start using it. We want to catch anything critical or important before we go live pretty soon, actually. In the next couple months, I guess, is what the goal is for that. Do Shai or Bryce, any thoughts or comments on release candidate 2?
I did the count yesterday, and we fixed about 40 bugs that were reported to us. And coming in GA, we have 7 more and counting, so keep them coming.
Nice.
Also, this is as close as it gets to live, so it's really encouraged that everybody and anybody just try it out. We're not doing really anything from now until the actual go live, except if critical bugs crop up. So this is your last chance, and I really hope a lot of people go and play around with this and report anything that happens. It's really very stable by now.
Yeah, you guys just literally said, like, very casually, yeah, we fixed 40 bugs. Like, that's a lot. Not that it's a lot of bugs, but just like, that's a lot of work to have done in a short iteration. So kudos to you guys.
Well, one of the things that I know drives the team is a goal to be defect zero, right? I mean, everyone wants bug-free software, but they are very, very driven to triage, capture, and address those defects. So kudos to the team for all the hard work in cleaning up the release. That's awesome. Our next link is, I'm not going to spend too much time on it because it segues right into what the whole intent of this episode is. And this is the Azure Cosmos DB repository.NET SDK v1.0.4. So this is a blog release. You can go out and read about what we're going to talk about today. We also have some other links that go to the GitHub repo and some other resources. But without jumping into it or stealing his thunder, David, why don't you tell us about this project that you have?
Yeah, so this is, well, I've got a whole bit kind of prepared for after the community links, but it was a passion of mine for many, many years. It's something I've been pursuing ever since Document DB, and it just came to fruition. I think the stars aligned when, I've only been with Microsoft for just over a year now. And before that, I had this kind of pattern that I had exposed around Document DB to help simplify some of the use cases for it. And now that I'm a part of Microsoft, I am able to leverage some of that content development weight and influence potential, things like this, be a part of the community and share this unofficial package. Right now it's not official, so it's just a side project of mine. So we'll jump into that more in a bit.
Sounds good. I like that, the whole unofficial projects, right?
Right.
I wonder how many projects that are official now started out unofficial. Not that that's a goal, but it is interesting that some of the best projects in my mind are the ones that solve a real world problem. It's not someone looking to, hey, I've got a solution, let me go find a problem, right? They're like, I've got a problem, I need to fix it. So
absolutely. And I think it was really encouraging because the community, once this blog post came out, there was many people approaching me saying that they've been doing the same thing for years. And they've had, the repository pattern wrapped around Cosmos. And it's one of those things where it's like, okay, if there's enough people actually doing this and buying into it, and utilizing that pattern to simplify, the API surface area, let's get behind it ourselves as an engineering effort and make it official. And I even call attention to that at the end of the blog post, saying that's my hope that, hopefully engineering will be like, yes, we'll take over now, right?
well, not assuming that everyone knows what the repository pattern is, kind of in a nutshell, do you have a 30-minute, that's great, 30-second elevator pitch? The 30-minute one we can save for a little later. But what is the repository pattern? Why do I even care as a developer?
Yeah, so this is really just an abstraction layer, one of many potential abstraction layers when you're developing things. So what it does is it abstracts away, the data store underneath, and it acts as an interface betwixt the data store and the shape of the objects that you want to persist. So it's a very simple interface. It's IRepository of T, where T can be any subclass of an item. And in this case, there's very simple C.R.U.D operations. So create, read, update, and delete functions that sit on top of that repository. Okay.
And so this package is an implementation specifically for Cosmos DB.
That is correct.
What makes it unique for Cosmos DB compared to, say, if it was a facade for SQL or a relational database, for example?
That's a good question. I guess it could be applied to other kind of providers under the covers. I haven't thought of that.
Okay.
But yeah, again, it's this one's married to Cosmos DB right now, and it's tethered to the .NET SDK, so it just sits on top of that. So there is certainly now we're talking about abstracting away even more and kind of making it even more generic and having different. I know there's ADO and EF and all those other different Postgres and all the things, right? SQLite. We could go on and on. But yeah, that's not a bad idea to do something like that.
Cool. So what does it look like? Do you have something to share with or show us?
Yeah. Can I share my screen now? We can do that.
We can do that.
So here is, so lots of people like to talk about how they've done the repository pattern, and I just created the unofficial one that's getting some attention, but it's been inspired, like I said, from this backstory. And we were talking years ago, so this is 4 years ago, where I had a wrapper around Document DB. So this is really the evolution of that vision. And I mean, back then it was very, very much the same type of thing. So we had a repository of T, and in there you could have, get, create, update, and delete, right? So create, all of your very common CRUD operations. And this interface really has evolved since then. So if we jump forward to the actual source code now, we have documentation, because I'm trying to be like a more official, open source developer, in that I'm providing some contextual bits for consumers of this NuGet package, right? So you'll get all of the documentation for the APIs, example code, how to do it, how to consume it, things like that. So rather than being just a simple, 10-line interface, it's a little bit more. We're using value task, but I'll get into some of the actual methods here, but let's just start at the top. So we've got a public interface, IRepository of t-item, where t-item is an item, and item is fairly straightforward. It's an abstract class, and I'll get into why in just a second. But what it does is it automatically provides a string ID that is assigned to a new globally unique identifier. And we have a type, and we have internally a partition key. So with Cosmos DB, there's this concept of partitioning. You can have logical partitions and physical partitions, and you have a relationship of a database, and then the database underneath that has containers, and then containers can have different partitions, right? So it's just it's a way to kind of scale out how you persist things. And consumers of Cosmos like having that kind of finite control. So we've exposed that for them. And but we handle a lot of the nuances. So if you don't care about partitioning, and this is where this kind of comes into play, where using this simplified repository pattern, it's really just another tool in your developer toolkit, right? It's not a replacement. Let me be very clear and state that again. This is not a replacement for the Cosmos DB .NET SDK. It's simply another tool. So you can use either or. I don't think I'd recommend using both of them in conjunction. But this serves a different purpose, right? It's really for more simple scenarios where you as a developer need to persist some sort of thing. And maybe you don't know what that thing fully looks like yet, right? So it can be schemaless. And it's just going to use Cosmos under the cover to persist and retrieve those as needed. And you can have, full object graphs. You can have hierarchies. You can have any of those things that you'd really like. And they just have to be some classes of item. So partitioning is handled for you, but you can override it. You can actually say, the default partitioning is based on the ID. But you can override that by having a subclass that overrides the get partition key value. And then you can specify, like, if you want to have a synthetic partition key instead. And then we've got the type parameter. This is because we have options for how our repository persists our POCOs or our objects. One of the options is actually to, by default, it does, I'm going to jump around a little bit here, but one of the options is to have a container per item type. So by default, this is false. So a lot of people in the Cosmos community said, well, I like having my data set up this way, where if I have an object of foo, I want it to be in a foo container, right? And if I have a bar, I want that to be in a bar container. And the way I initially implemented this is I said, I don't care. You can have multiple items that are different shapes, and it just works because the ID is really what it's pulling back from, and it's partitioned that way. And, you have finite control over that. So there's various options for how you want to utilize this. So one of the options is to have a container per type, and then the type name becomes the container. Likewise, if that's false, everything ends up in the same container, and everything, at that point would have the same partition key and stuff like that.
But then you have that type override so that you know what you're mapping it to, which on our EF core provider, we call it a discriminator, right? So the type gets stored in the container, but it has that discriminator so that you can infer the schema that you're going to rehydrate it to.
Yeah, I should probably steal that name. Discriminator.
It's ancient. I think it comes from a discriminated union, where the discriminator tells you which of the union it is.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what, as soon as you said that, that's where my mind went. Discriminated unions. I'm a big language advocate for TypeScript. So I love that, when Anders introduced discriminated unions, and you can get me talking about that all day. It's ridiculous.
They're considering them for C#10 for anybody.
Yes.
Very exciting stuff.
So there was a question here I want to show really quickly. It was, can this be used with Atlas MongoDB? And I'm going to go out and say that your kit sits on top of the Azure Cosmos DB. So no, but the repository pattern, of course, can be implemented in front of virtually any type of data access, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, you are 100% correct. And the repository pattern is something that's been around for years and years. It's nothing new. It's kind of new to the Cosmos space. Other people have implemented it, as I mentioned before. I've been doing it for a long time now. That pattern can be re-implemented in other types of scenarios, but this one is married to Cosmos DB exclusively. The great thing is it's open source. So if you would like to take a stab at going out there and doing a pull request and kind of dissecting those parts and decoupling them a little bit and having some sort of provider abstraction layer where you specify, we want to use Mongo here and get that same interface with the same kind of simplicity, I would highly encourage you to do so.
Yeah, I was just going to say too, one thing I think a lot of people talk about with the repository pattern is some of its uses, like, is it overkill with Entity Framework, right? Because Entity Framework is an API for data access. And one of the things that I found is I've been doing a lot of work with Blazor, and in Blazor, if you are trying to build code that can run on Blazor WebAssembly and Blazor Server, then the repository pattern is perfect for that, because you can't run directly to Entity Framework core from inside the browser. But if you implement the repository pattern, what you can do is talk to the repository pattern. On the server, you just talk directly to the database. In the browser, you talk to a web API that calls the server that talks to the database. But the main code and library stay the same. You just swap out that implementation. So that's one example of how this is incredibly useful. And I'm sure for testing,
Absolutely.
It makes a huge difference too.
Yeah, I started writing down an issue to track a new feature where I want to introduce some utilitarian implementations for tests, so that consumers of this could have like a test implementation that they could rely on for, doing unit tests to validate, like if they have a service tier that takes on the repository, what does that look like? How could they mock things out? But we do have another question here. Someone's mentioning that Cosmos DB is costly, and I'd like to directly address that by saying, I don't have to pay for it. No, we do have some options in here to kind of look at that. So the Cosmos team has been doing various things, and one of them specifically is to optimize bandwidth. I default this to true, and what that does is it actually enables content response on write. It sets that to false. It's kind of an invert binary there, but if you optimize bandwidth, what it's going to do is anything that writes to the Cosmos API, I'm going to instantiate under the covers and item request options where I'm disabling writing of the response. And so what this does is, for creations or upserts, patches, replaces, all of those things, it's going to reduce the networking and CPU load when, sending things over the network. And I think that actually helps out with request units. I think that's how a lot of it's kind of RUs are kind of how things are tracked internally for Cosmos consumption. In addition to that, we allow for bulk execution. This is another feature that marries to one of their options internally. So when we fan out, so what I mean by that is we have an interface here for the IRepository that says create, create async given an IEnumerable of items. So all these values. Under the covers, it's doing a task.winAll, and it's fanning out and delegating back to create async on the individual thing. Internally, the Cosmos client has a way to kind of batch those calls if you explicitly set this allow bulk execution. So it makes it a little bit more optimized. Instead of having, for example, a list of 50 items that does 50 API calls, it'll do one API call with 50 items, right? So there's some little things like that that kind of help address some of those costly concerns. Because again, a lot of this is tied back to consumption and RU, which is like request units.
Yeah, I keep creating work for myself. I have a repo that I haven't updated in a couple of years, but when Cosmos first came out, I did a repo that pulls down the USDA nutrition database and stores it in a container and allows you to work with that. I'd be interested to implement this in front of it and use batching and see how, because the longest part is when it's importing all the items and wiring up the database. So that's a perfect candidate for batch insert and batch updates. We'll have to check that out and see how that performs.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd be curious about that too. So we're going to go into the weeds a little bit here because I have some internals that I'd like to kind of just show how I implemented these things. So under the covers, we have a Cosmos client provider. And this, I'm just going to kind of go through the interfaces and then show you the default implementations for those providers. So what this does is it abstracts away the consumption of the Cosmos client so that I can share the functionality, because it is a shared Cosmos client for the SDK. So when you're consuming my SDK, I'm guaranteeing that you're going to get a singleton. So it's a single instance of that client. So that's one of the recommendations from the team. In addition to that, we've got a Cosmos container provider, and this provides the container for a given item. Again, this relates back to the ability to have a single container per item type. But if you have that toggled off, you'll just get the same container, right? It just will share the container. And then a container is tied to a database. So there's a database that sits on top of that. The way I've kind of architected and designed this implementation is such that when you configure your instance with the options, the only real thing that you need is a Cosmos connection string. And from that, we default to having a database ID of database because we're good at naming things. You can obviously override that. But again, the only thing you need is that. And if you don't override database, you'll get a database instance under your connection string for Cosmos, your Cosmos resource. And if you're doing a container per type, or actually, if you're doing not container per type, the default container ID is container. Again, that's overridable. And then you're off to the races with it. So then you'll get your container instance, either one or many, depending on how you configure it. And then we actually have a Cosmos partition key path provider. And this basically allows for the finite control of individual items to specify their partition key path. And again, there's defaults for you so that if you don't want to have that, if you kind of opt out of it, there's all these defaults that take place. So you could use this with literally just a connection string, and it will work for persisting all of your subclasses of item, without fail, and handle a lot of scalability and things like that. But so once you start getting into more concerns of larger objects, deeper object graphs or hierarchies and things of that, you can start getting more finite control over that.
So I love that. I hate APIs that require you to configure 50 things that are the same every time. So having sensible defaults makes sense. But before we jump into it, I don't want to break up your flow because you may be getting ready to talk about this.
Sure.
But we had this great question, maybe a second on task versus value task. I know, relatively speaking, value tasks are newer to some people with C#. So can you explain the difference and why you would use one over the other?
Yeah, so I'm going to show a good example here real quick. Where is it? So someplace I have a task versus value task, and it's intentional. So the repository exposes all value tasks. And the reason for that is value task was introduced as a means to, it's a read-only struct. So being a value type, there's less concerns with potential overhead that might be unnecessary allocations at certain points where hot paths are executed or something's already there, or there's and I guess Bryce or Shai chime in to help out with examples of engineering value task over task and reasons for that. But the API for the repository itself is all value task based. There's a few internals in here that do. I'm trying to see where they are. I thought I had one.
You had one pulled up a second ago that had a task.
trying to remember where that was.
I
Lots of
just asked
okay.
Shai which one I need to use, and he tells me.
Here's an example. So the container provider. So this one is a task intentionally. And the reason this is a task is because I know that within my implementation, this will be awaited multiple times. And there was a blog post from Stephen Tobe where he said not to await value task multiple times. So I just listened to him. So if you listen to Shai, I listen to Stephen. So yeah, this has potentially a bit more overhead because it's a class versus a value type, but just one of those optimizational things where my general rule of thumb is if I can get away with using a value task and I know that it's not going to be awaited multiple times, I try to use value task. That's just like, I guess, my go-to.
I'll just maybe add one thing. So yeah, this is a subject that's very close to my heart. One piece of guidance here is that when there's no return value, so when you're returning like a non-generic value task or task, then the general guidance is that you want to return a task rather than a value task because there's no real advantage to the value task anymore. It's not like it's horrible to return a non-generic value task. It's fine. It will actually usually just add a little bit of overhead because it's wrapping. So that's like just one small piece of thing. But yeah, I mean, in general, as you said, if you're not sure if a certain function is going to return, if it's actually going to do IO or not, then usually you're going to just return a value task because for the cases where it doesn't perform IO, it's going to save that task allocation behind the scene and be a little bit more. But it's a complicated subject. Everybody has to go through this, and even people with a lot of experience kind of get confused on when should I use what. So just so everybody's aware.
Awesome.
Maybe one question I had, I'm just going to interject as I've already interjected, is there is one more possibility there. I saw you in some cases returning a value task of an enumerable. And now that we're so recently in .NET, Core 3.3.1, now we have async enumerable as well, which is another kind of thing we can throw into the mix. So I kind of wanted to ask if there's a specific reason you're not returning async enumerables, or what's up with that?
So I'm using, because I'm sitting on top of the Cosmos .NET SDK, it's tethered to .NET Standard 2.0.
I see.
So I'm limited right there with what I'm
Good answer.
Yeah. Otherwise, that was something I already had. Their V4 of their SDK actually exposes async enumerable, and I already have a branch locally that I haven't pushed up yet that's been kind of slightly massaging the existing API to see where maybe V3 will get. Because one thing that we mentioned is that blog post from last week, that's where I introduced version 1.0.4. As of today, I'm already on 2.0.2. So
my goodness, you're busy.
It's evolving. Yeah, it's just a passion.
Watch out, he's faster than us.
I have a project that I've been working on for, I think, 6 months, and it's still .9. So put that in perspective.
Yeah, I like to code, and it's kind of an obsession of mine. Cool. No, that's really good. So I've got more stuff we can show. We can jump right into. I've showed some of the the interfaces, the contracts, if you will, but the actual implementations are pretty straightforward, I think. I might be biased, but so the default repository, it basically takes on a container provider and a options monitor for our repository options and a logger. And a lot of people get kind of hung up on this type of constructor. And I just want to call attention to the fact that this is kind of C# snobbery, so to speak. But we've got these three dependencies that we're taking on. And we're actually expressing this constructor with an expression bodied member. And we have a tuple literal here that is going to be deconstructed and assigned to our read-only fields. So basically in a single line, you can have what might otherwise would have been, 5 or 6 lines worth of code. And it's just a way to express it. And since it's internal to me, I kind of know how it's going to work, and I don't need to get, more verbose. But so then go ahead.
I make heavy use of those name tuples, if you will.
Yeah.
That's exciting. But we were talking about .NET Standard 2.0 and 2.1. There are so many language features that spoil me to death. that is jarring when you have to work on a project that's an old version and can't use the new language features, like just the array manipulators, like, what is that symbol? Up caret 0 or 1 for the
index
last
ranges
one.
and
Yeah.
ranges. Yep. Oh,
Yeah.
I love that stuff. The other one that I've been using a lot of is switch expressions. Oh,
yes.
I love me some switch expressions. Absolutely.
Pattern matching. All the new stuff in C#9 pattern matching. Wow.
Absolutely.
Super amazing.
We're using some of that on the website, so hopefully I've got time to share some of that. But so this is just the default implementation. So to kind of walk through one of the essential user flows for getting. So there's given an ID and a partition key. Internally, we rely on a container. So we walk up to the container, and if the partition key is default, we'll instantiate it given our default scenario, which is the ID that we're looking for. And then this is the actual container. So this is kind of this is where we get into the API that we're encapsulating and abstracting away. So they have a read item async given our item, our partition key and ID, ConfigureWeightFalse, and then we get this item response of T, and then I hold on to T, and if we have trace or if we have debug logging enabled, we'll serialize that lazily for consumers so that they can see what the objects are. This is just a debugging tool. And I've actually added some other debugging tools which have been helpful. Like for the HTTP client, I add a specific header for my provider so that I can work with the Cosmos team to kind of track the usage to see if people are actually using this thing or not.
So can I ask a quick question for those who are probably curious and don't do as much with async and await? What is ConfigureWeightFalse?
ConfigureWeightFalse basically will configure the synchronization context. So when you say false, you're actually specifying that you don't need to continue on the captured context. And one of the ironies of this is that there's actually not a synchronization context with .NET Core, as I understand it. I thought maybe ASP.NET Core, there wasn't one specifically. But since this is a library, we're going to be kind to other .NET Standard 2.0 consumers that might be on different runtimes. Is that correct?
ASP.NET doesn't have, they dropped their synchronization context like a super long time ago, but stuff like WinForms and WPF, so basically, thick UI, if that term is still used. So UI kind of stuff, you still have to run code in the UI thread in order to manipulate stuff, and that's exactly where the synchronization context gets into.
Yep.
So basically every library on Earth in .NET, which should be agnostic of where it's running, should always have ConfigureWeightFalse everywhere. That's kind of the guidance.
Yep. So this is me trying to be a good, friendly, open source .NET developer. And again, I'm just a content developer on the .NET team. So, so that's, basically a lot of things are just kind of wrapping away what otherwise might be something like this, right? Some sort of, I'd hate for consumers to have to write this every time they need to get, something based on a predicate, right? Or an expression. So instead, I abstract it all away. So it's really, really simple. And we have some capabilities within here that are, pretty exciting to talk about. So there's this notion of like a FeedIterator. As a consumer of Cosmos, do you really want to know about a FeedIterator? Do you care? Like if you have a connection string, wouldn't it be great if you just said, here's my item, let's go get it. Give me all of them that match this predicate, or here's this item, go save it, right? So this is, again, kind of speaking to the advantages of what the goal of this project really is. And it's just trying to abstract away all of these various complexities where you have to have a database and you have to have a container and you have to have various items with partition keys and all this stuff. And it's like some of those things have been kind of, it's like a leaked abstraction, so to speak. And it's, I think the repository pattern is one of the perfect examples to apply it to this type of scenario.
And that's very valid because when I talk to people about using EF Core Provider for Cosmos DB, a lot of times one of the reasons they use it is just less ceremony and ritual. It's just a familiar set of gestures to get up and running instead of doing all these configuration steps that you said. So having something like this with sensible defaults again is definitely a boon for development.
Yeah. So we actually had, I'm going to wait for my internet to load this. This is the actual repository. So iEvangelist, that's my GitHub, and Azure Cosmos .NET repository. Well, there was an issue that a user and community member had posted, and they were asking the question about EF Core DB provider versus this, right? And they're like, well, why would I use one versus the other? And I'm like, well, first of all, this is unofficial. So, it's just a side project of mine. Take it as you will, do what you want with it. But there is one quote that I'd like to call attention to. And this is, I'm not going to share the individual's name, but they had messaged me and said that this repository library is smaller, faster, and simpler than the EF provider by a wide margin for the Cosmos DB stuff. And it's like, well, if I could help someone that way, but again, I want to stress that this is just another tool, right? And you as a developer, it's your responsibility to determine what tool you want to use for your specific job or your specific needs. So to have a statement like this is, while it's awesome and it's flattering, there is probably a lot more of the underlying functionality that's exposed in the EF Core provider that sits on top of Cosmos that probably has all of the features that you'd want from Cosmos, right? So mine's a limited scope of those things, just to be very, very clear.
Yeah, I can say something about this. So I definitely have no interest in pushing the EF way to do it rather than this. So I think this is great. It's great to see this kind of thing. It's just worth remembering that EF kind of gives you a much more high level kind of massive functionality. Whereas this, I kind of imagine, for those of you familiar, seems a bit like maybe the Dapper of Cosmos. So people who are familiar maybe with Dapper, which is a great thing. I love Dapper. I know Bryce does too. So I think it's a great compliment, by the way. So like in EF, for example, there's a whole concept of change tracking. So you're going to be loading things and then changing them in your program, and then EF Core will figure out exactly what needs to be saved back, right? So this kind of very high level functionality is something that Dapper and this kind of thing they don't really strive to do, which is completely fine. Right. And you're going to decide as a user if you want that or not. And that also kind of explains where why the EF Core approach is kind of heavier, and you're bringing in more stuff, and you're getting more in return as well, of course, but you may not want that. So evaluate and decide and choose.
I was going to say, these are all the exact reasons I love Dapper. Is like, I don't need all the change tracking. I don't need all the ceremony. I know the SQL I'm going to write. I don't even need a link provider. But on the other hand, I don't want to deal with DB parameter objects and DB commands and getting back a reader. I just want a simple sugar method like execute this.
Right. Yeah, and I'm a huge fan of results. I'm a big fan of Dapper. I've actually, before joining Microsoft, in my role as an evangelist, I had worked with some enterprise companies doing consulting. And we had used Insight.database, which I understand it to be an early fork of Dapper. And they had introduced async APIs to it before Stack Overflow realized that they needed those. And Insight Database was very much that same type of thing. It was simplified ceremony. So when that's kind of like the evolution of where I decided to introduce the repository pattern on top of Cosmos. Because we said, okay, we want to start doing we want to use this new kind of document database thing, the NoSQL stuff, right? We were so tied to relational data structures that we thought it was the only way. So then it's like, oh, we've learned about NoSQL. Let's abstract away some of these complexities and have this. And that's where I started kind of doing this pattern. So I'm going to share my screen some more.
Maybe you should rename this like Cosper or Daposmos or something. No.
Naming is fun.
Yeah.
It's the greatest.
You don't like the name Azure Cosmos DB Repository.NET SDK?
It is succinct. This is what I like about it. It's succinct.
Well,
it has the most chances of becoming a Microsoft product.
Right. And especially with the versioning, right? We're on 2.0.2 already, and it just came out. So yeah, I wanted to show some various consumption scenarios for this. Thank you, Richard, for that comment. This is fantastic. I've built a similar repository for Cosmos years ago and was wondering if something awesome. Thank you. So one of the common scenarios is utilizing the repository pattern in your day-to-day development. So imagine that we have this web tier. So in the samples folder of the repository, we actually have like a service tier, how to do that from like a background service or something, or a web tier, right? Very, both very valid use cases where you might want to persist and read data. So I'm going to show you how this is exposed. So both of these projects take on a dependency for the Cosmos repository package. And in our configure services, again, this is very common nomenclature with .NET Core, kind of evolving from like startup semantics with Owen and Katana, things like that. But it's been, a first-class citizen now for a while, and that is dependency injection. So we have this iService collection services, and from that we have an add Cosmos repository that takes a configuration, an iConfiguration. So these are two very common things that exist: a configuration in a startup, and this adding of the thing that you care about, and an extension method that just comes in to the Microsoft.extensions.dependency injection namespace. So what that does is that wires up from my configuration the consumption of iCosmos repository. That's literally the only line that we need, in addition to actually having the configuration provided from one of the providers. I simply have it in properties right now as a startup ARG. So I'll show what that looks like. But you could have it in environment variables. You could have it in app settings JSON. You could have it wherever things might want to be, like app secrets or Azure Key Vault, things like that. So now we have a model. I'm going to show you my model. And I say class, language, and we are a subclass of item, and we add just our get sets, the things that we care about, right? Very, very straightforward, nothing complex in there at all. We have a programming style, functional, object-oriented, procedural, and I just threw this together. So there's going to be people that are going to say, wait a second, there's more programming styles that aren't there. And don't focus on that. Focus on how we've modeled this, right? So then we have a language controller. And this is just an API controller, and we are a subclass of controller base. And from here, for the convenience of, I could take on like an iRepository of language here if I wanted instead. DI will provide either that, like an iRepository of language, or I added for convenience an iRepository factory. So I can say factory.repository of language. And now I get an iRepository of language. And I have this API that does get, post, put, and delete. So this entire controller, this entire API surface area, which is 42 lines of code, and our startup, which is a single line after we ported our thing in, if we set this as the default startup, and one other thing I'm going to call attention to, I do have Swagger. Swagger, Swashbuckle, which is the open API stuff. Since I'm using that, I don't have to write a user interface, right? I'm trying to keep it very simple. So I'm going to run this application, and I'm going to show you that this is actually talking to an actual Cosmos instance and will work the way you'd want it to. But I guess I'm curious, for those who are watching, how difficult does that look from a consumer aspect to take on the dependency to the project, say, here's my configuration, add it into your DI pipeline, and then simply ask for iRepositories of the thing you care about? Yes. Oh, no, that's a very common thing. I do that after every show. Don't worry. I think someone had mentioned they wanted to do a like some sort of little abstraction, like something that like masks any private keys or things that are shown. Like there's some sort of tooling option there for streamers. So if you're out there and you're thinking, ooh, how could we do that? I think someone actually had done that at one point in time, but it was tethered to like the Azure portal.
Yeah, the Cloud Advocates team had a tool that they created that automatically understood which tags were like subscription IDs and keys and would blur them out on it. But the portal team changed the portal faster than the blurry team could keep up with the blurry. So I'm not sure if that's still maintained or kept up now anymore. So we just recreate the resources now.
Hashtag blurry team. That's what I'm going to. If you remember anything from the show, hashtag blurry team. I had release because I was actually inspired by you, Jeremy. I just saw one of your repositories that you had put out there on GitHub, and you have all of the CI/CD stuff in place to do like publishing your NuGet packages. And I need help with that. So all I have is like build validation. That's why I was on release mistakenly. So when I started to try to debug just now, it's like, you can't. Are you sure you want to debug this release build? Because that's what I'm doing with my packages. So that's a call to action for anyone watching the show. If you want to help out and help kind of set up GitHub Actions to, push things to NuGet and auto increment versions, I would love to collaborate with you in that regard. So let's see, this should be starting.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan. There's a tool called NerdBean Git version. And it's a package. There's basically a command line tool that you can install as a global .NET tool, and you can include it in your directory props or your solution files, and it automatically handles versioning. You just tag it, it'll tag the commits, it'll stamp the builds.
Did you say NerdBean or is that NerdBank?
Maybe it's NerdBank. It's MBGV. I use it all the time, so I know the MB stands for. I'm not being a good promoter of the product that I'm sponsoring here. No, I'm not sponsoring, but yeah, it's MBGV. Just look for that, and it will help. It basically implements sim versioning in your projects.
Awesome. I don't know why this was taking so long to load up. I blame the internet. So we have our Swagger API definition here. This is going to load, I promise, eventually. And this isn't a concern of Cosmos being slow, because actually Cosmos is very, very fast. So this is our language API. I'm going to get all the stuff, try that out, and you'll see that we do have under the covers a way to pull back the languages that we've got configured. I should probably open up the portal as well, but I'll leak more things that way.
Give us the whole point of this was no more. The whole point of,
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you. I insist.
I was going to say I'll end up leaking all of the credentials everywhere. So yeah, now we get back this array of languages, right? So we've got C# and JavaScript, apparently the only two languages that we've persisted in here. But you get an ID, you get aliases, you get all the things, and you can create new ones. So if we want to post a new language, let's do so. I'm going to get rid of ID because that comes automatically. And we could say, what do we want to say? Type. I want to get rid of type as well. That we know it's a language. Found it. Nerdbank.get versioning. Thank you for that. So let's create a new language. What do we want to name it?
Go faster.
Fancy go fast lang. Alias. Obviously, we're going to have an alias that is the SFGFL, which is just the acronym. Description, Jeremy's made up thing. And we're going to say it's functional, and we're going to execute that. And it's going to execute, insert the thing. It's in there already, back instantaneously almost. And I think, yeah. So one of the cool things is I've got the debug stuff toggled on for our logging. So you get to see kind of like the request and the response. You get to actually see the generated Cosmos DB query definitions themselves, which is really cool. You actually get to see the hydrated JSON objects put to the output. That's an option, right, if you want to have debug on. So it's really convenient for kind of analyzing how things are working. So let's go get this individual one. So if we just grab this ID, and this is just exercising those various decorator pattern based controller endpoints. So we've got an ID here, and this should get back Jeremy's amazing made up language. And it does, right?
It is amazing.
It's totally amazing. There's
no keywords. You save a blank file and it does stuff. So
right. Yeah, so that's pretty much that in a nutshell. And we're actually using it. One thing I didn't show was we're actually using it on the NetDocShow itself. So the NetDocShow, this is a bit of a little segue into what our thing's about. So the NetDocShow is a Blazor server-side web app that I built, and we use it to kind of host historical shows and upcoming shows, and this is where people can submit ideas. But all of these shows, these are basically little show objects that are pulled directly out of the Cosmos DB. And I'm using this repository. I have a service layer that wraps it, and we've got all the show information. We got upcoming shows. If I click on it, I did click on it, right? Click, press buttons. Oh, I must have clicked on an actual show. But anyways, so there's the source code for that. And I did have another link here that we can probably add to the URL list, which is a discussion more formally on partitioning in Azure Cosmos DB. But that's pretty much it in a nutshell. There's various ways to consume it. It's DI ready, configuration, options pattern ready, async, value task, all the things, generic, enjoy.
Can you show a piece of code from maybe from the site that you're using that consumes it, just to show like well, I guess you just showed the controller API. It's not more complex than that, is it?
Well, I'll show you here. So we have, this is the .NET-Docs.web. This is the Blazor server-side project. And in there, we have a reference to our .NET Docs services. And that service is just, again, all those different services for the app itself. So we got date time service. We have an iSchedule service. We have logic apps we're using for some of the scheduling and emailing and calendar management. We've got a Twitch service and Twitter service, to pull up images and stuff, and Twitch to pull down video content and post video content, things like that, right? All this cool stuff. And then we have an iSchedule service. And the iSchedule service just works against this DocShow object. And the DocShow is a subclass of item. And it has all these things, right? It's got people in it. It's got hosts, tags, title, URL, various bits of information about our show. We even have hard-coded people that are hosts. I need to add Cecil and Maria. Maria Wenzel and Cecil Phillip both have joined as hosts. So why don't we just do that right now? I have to add them. But so that's our iSchedule service. And the implementation is very, very simply just the decorator pattern taking on an iRepository of DocShow. And we pull all of it, we persist all of it, and we actually created like a simple content management system basically for our site. So we can, from there, create shows, edit them, and they're live instantaneously on the site. We're using background services, the hosted service pattern from .NET Core, and we're using memory caching and things like that. So if we go look at the service worker, we've got our iSchedule service and our iMemory cache, and the background hosted service basically will sit here and hydrate our cache accordingly. And the site is very, very responsive. But we can bust the cache internally, since we can walk up to the iMemory cache, and as things update, it's basically pump updates into that, and it's all real time. We don't even have like a staging or testing site. It's just all in production, which is great.
Nice.
But the really cool thing, and this is one thing I really want to emphasize, is if you are watching this show, one of the huge advantages, I can't stress this enough, is if you go look at the changelog, all the commits from this website, and look at the POCOs, the classes here under the services, and look at the evolution of these objects. Because Cosmos is schemaless, right? It doesn't really pertain, it doesn't really care about it, right? As your object evolves, you can add things where in historical situations of relational databases, you would be breaking the world. Or in EF, for example, you'd have migrations. Raise your hand if you love doing migrations and having all that extra stuff, right? Come on. And that's just one of those things. It's one of those things, right? So for me, it was something I was personally not a fan of. And with Cosmos, you don't need to worry about that.
I think we need to have a war now between the schemaless and the schema people now. Get out the guns.
It's like tabs versus spaces, right?
Yeah, except that we're right and you're wrong on that case.
Well, no, I prefer semicolons.
So it's not going to complicate things any further, but it used to be, I'd say it doesn't have to be either or, right? You can have a relational database for your relational data,
Oh, and then there's the guy who tries to compromise and bring people together, of course.
Well, no, but so what's blurring the lines now is now SQL's building in support for JSON so that you can query and pull JSON. So it's a relational database with a document store, and then you've got a crazy time.
That is very true. And we even intend to bring a lot of support for that for relational databases in EF Core 6. So I can't really argue against this. So.
Oh, yeah. That's really funny.
It makes it very interesting to go down that decision tree and start with. I mean, it used to be, right, the traditional C#.NET developer worked on SQL Server, so it was like I have a database, I go SQL. Well, now there's options, and it's that path. I have data. What am I going to do? How am I going to store this? What's the most optimal way? And of course, cost comes into it, API. You know, if you have something like this repository facade and it's going to make easier development and it handles what you need, then that's the way to go. But yeah.
My friend Obi, I love the hybrid approach. I am an equal opportunity employer.
No discrimination here against data mapping techniques.
That's funny. Someone says yes SQL instead of no SQL.
There you go.
Love it.
Very positive. All right. Well, very cool. Let's see if this is a great opportunity. We've got a few minutes on the tail end to answer questions if anything came up that someone hasn't had a chance to ask yet. I'll keep my eye on chat.
That Yes SQL is actually a product by Sebastian Ross worked on Orchard. He's on the ASP.NET team, and it lets you use a relational database without a schema. So, it has it
handles all the
entity type and then like columns for each property. It's very denormalized.
Well, since we're talking about that, I worked on a project that was like that. Basically, it was a migration, and the existing project had two sides to it. It had a business, compute side that was basically a bunch of Visual Basic objects, and it followed the pattern of having one base class that does everything in the world, and then everything inherits and just calls into it. And then it had a database that, as a customer, I could make changes. And if I made a change, it would split off a table, prefix with my customer name, automatically generate the schema to have my custom field, then generate a view that would take the regular field, join to the extended table. And so they were very successful company and had hundreds of customers. So their database literally had hundreds of these prefix tables that were customizations and extensions. So,
wow.
So it's something that would have been easily solved, right, in the document database world. So
I did see a question. I'm going to share my screen again and address that question. I'm going to throw it up here real quick. So we have someone asking, can I get repository B from repository A using Cosmos repository? No. So what you can... Well, I mean, so this is where the type comes into, or the discriminator rather comes into play. So if you have a repository of B and that's what you ask for from DI, and you have the shape of that object as declaratively as a B, right, for the type parameter. And for example, you're using it and you have object A and you try to deserialize object B into object A, it's going to work partially if there's things that are named the same, right? Because it's just JSON serialization. And there's going to be a conflict. So I'm actually going to basically fail and say, you don't even get that object back because the discriminator doesn't match. But I think what you're actually asking is a slightly different question where you have one repository using and consuming another repository, and that's not really a likely scenario either. So what I did want to show is the availability of, with dependency injection, they have these generic type parameters that you can say of T. So one of the cool things is I say add singleton, and I say type of IRepository blank type parameters, comma, maps over to the definitely typed default repository. And what this does is, since they're generic types, it's a one-to-one mapping. So any explicit subclass, if you have foo and bar, they get their own default repository implementation from DI. And the same is true with the repository factory. It just uses the service provider under the covers to serve that back to you. But I do have an example of where this is useful. And a good friend of mine, Brady Gaster, is using my library right now, and he has an ingredients recipe controller API. And as part of that, he's got 2 iRepositories, one for recipe and one for ingredient. And you could take both of those, so you could have multiple parameters into your controller constructor, where you take on an iRepository of recipe and an iRepository of ingredient. Or you could take the convenience-based factory approach, where you say, just give me the factory, and internally in the constructor, I will resolve a repository of recipe and a repository of ingredient. But again, we do try to marry these 2 types.
Types are fun. Generics are even way more fun.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. All right. Well, that takes us to the top of the hour, and that was fun. I'm excited about Cosmos DB. I'm excited about pulling up that old project of mine that I keep getting security alerts for, and updating it to patch it and use the new pattern. So thank you for your time, David. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into the show. As always, we appreciate you. Please reach out to our team. Let us know who you'd like to see, what you'd like to have us cover. And we will see you on GitHub, the internet, social media, and wherever you may be. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.